Hey there, I'm Dr. Jill Wener. I'm a meditation teacher, physician, tapping instructor, and an aspiring anti-racist, requiring constant self-evaluation and learning and examination. And I am so excited to have Melissa Shah here today with me. I've been a bit of a fangirl of hers without having connected to her personally, which happens a lot in the social media day and age. Melissa is a yoga therapist. She has her master's in public health, and she's an incredible writer as well. And Melissa, I'm so excited to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jill.
So first, I guess before we get started, I'd like to, or to get started, can you tell me a little bit about your background in the yoga and wellness space, in your experience as an Indian woman navigating that space here in the West, where it has been co-opted by white people?
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up practicing yoga from when I was pretty young, probably younger than I think, didn't know what it was. But my mom had always been practicing yoga. My grandmother and my grandfather, who were both very into Ayurveda. So it was kind of just a part of our family, even though I didn't fully have language for it or recognize what it was. But when I was about 11 or 12 years old, my mom started, I would say, I want to say coaxing, but it was really like pushing me and my sister to do yoga more regularly. I was diagnosed with asthma at the age of 2. And so it was pretty severe, like my whole childhood. And of course, I mean, you're a physician, I know you know this, but like what comes with that is like a lot of sinus colds, a lot of congestion. And what I know now, what I didn't know then was just a lot of fear. Every time like you would have a symptom or like you couldn't breathe, it would like always like bring up all this stuff. But my mom at one point, I was taking a bunch of different like steroid medication, things like that. And around middle school time, my mom was like, enough's enough. Like you have to like take this more seriously in terms of yoga. And she's like, I'm your mom. And so you're probably not going to take me as seriously. And so you're going to go and learn from one of our family friends. And so my mom would take my sister and I like several days a week after school to our family friend's house, where he would teach, and it would just be like an adult hatha yoga class. And my sister and I were like, I think 11 and 13 at the time, maybe, or maybe even younger. And there was this concept of going to like a kids yoga class or a tweens class that we have so much of that now. It was not a thing, or not a thing that I knew of anyway. And so my sister and I would go to our family friend's house and we would just do this like 2-hour adult class, or like hour and a half adult class. And you were expected to like give your full attention the whole time. And I definitely enjoyed it, but there was a huge part of me that was always just like never wanted to share it with like any of my friends or anyone else I knew, because yoga, everyone was like, what is that? Or you're so weird because you're Indian, And so I always was like, oh, I have to like do this thing after school, or I have to go to like dance class or something like that. And I never really shared it in a way that now my nieces and nephews who've been doing yoga since they were like 2 or 3 years old, now, and they're like in elementary school or going to middle school, they're all like so proud of their yoga practice. They're like, look, I can do all of these things. And I just don't ever remember that being my experience when I was younger, but it was like this whole other world for me, which was also really cool. So that's sort of how I started practicing as a way to really help my asthma when I was younger, which it did. And then ever since then, I've just been, I wouldn't say I was hooked in the sense that I was like, I was 13 years old. I wouldn't say that I was, so interested and I'm like, oh, I can't wait to study this stuff. But I definitely enjoyed it. And I saw how it helped. And I think we say this, like my teachers in yoga therapy say this a lot, that yoga is an experiential practice. Like you can tell someone all day long that they should be doing yoga, right? Patients or clients or friends, like, this is really what you need to do. This will help your back. This will help that. But none of it really matters until the person actually has the experience. And I definitely, like looking back on it now, I really felt that when I was younger. I saw how it helped my asthma symptoms so much, and it helped my confidence. And because of that, it kept on leading me back to the practice. I just didn't know what that link was at the time. And then around high school is when my teacher was like, I think you're ready to start studying to be an instructor if that's something you want to do. I was like, yeah, sure, you know, and it was very much like a traditional you studied with your teacher one-on-one. He lived in New Hampshire, and my mom, my family, we'd all go up there for like 3 or 4 days and all learn for the weekend. And that's how I started like learning, really how I started learning yoga therapy and learning how to be a teacher, probably around like 17 or 18 years old.
Wow.
Ever since then, I've just been like, yeah, I've just been studying ever since. I'm 32 now, which is it's just pretty crazy. Like looking back, you know, and starting out, like just not knowing, right? You don't even know what you have until you see how yoga has been really stripped down of all these elements that were so, I couldn't imagine my practice without those things.
Yeah.
And I had never, you know, I started practicing when I was so young. I hadn't been to a yoga studio until I was probably 23 or 24. It never even occurred to me to go to one. But then I was broke in grad school, and I was living in Manhattan with my cousin, who sweetly let me live on her couch for 2 years. And I like had you know, just was a grad student. I didn't have money, and I was living in New York at that. And so I remember finding all like the monthly deals to try different studios and stuff. Cause, and that's really how I ended up in those spaces. And it was really my first like direct experience with cultural appropriation, I would say. I mean, in terms of yoga, like I think I've experienced a lot of situations when I was younger, and it's like I was so shocked, like it didn't register. But I think when I was older and started going to studios, there was a part of me that was like, some of this is really not okay. And there was another part of me was like, if I don't teach this way, no one's ever going to come to my class. And it was like these like two parts, I think, that have just always been there until recently, when I've just been really encouraged by amazing like friends and teachers in my life to be like, actually, like you can talk about these things, and also people will listen, and also it's really important that you do. I guess it's been a little bit about my experience so far, or from when I was younger.
Have you had experiences where you felt unwelcome because you are Indian, like you were not the norm? Was that your personal experience?
Yeah, you know, I do think about that sometimes, because I feel like everywhere, I really haven't practiced at that many different studios, to be honest. I know a lot of people might be like this, but my husband and I are both like, you know, when we find a place, we find a teacher, we're just like, we stick there like glue usually. So I haven't like hopped around like enough to really say that, but I've never had the experience where somebody's like, you know, you can't come. And really people don't say, like, I've never really heard anyone be like, it's not, they don't directly say those things, right? It's in everything else. It's like, I've seen it, I guess, in the ways I don't feel welcome is like when I've been like exotified studios, or when you just walk in and you're like consistently like, I am the only person that's not white in this room, always, including the teacher. I think other ways I felt like really unwelcome, or just really out of place, is when, you know, I would hear music of like Indian music being appropriated, or like mantras being appropriated, and they're on like full blast, and then the class is like being choreographed to the music, and it's just like, you know, objectively you see it and you're like, okay, you know, whatever, people are having a good time and they're experiencing yoga, but it's not really the point, you know? And I feel like in those ways I've felt, you know, these aren't the spaces for me, and there's no effort being taken from the studios or teachers, or places I've been. There was no effort being taken to actually like rectify any of those things. And I definitely didn't feel safe bringing them up. So I guess in those ways, yes, but you know, I've definitely had friends who have had personal experiences that have been like really harmful, and I don't think I can speak to like necessarily having the same ones.
What are so you mentioned, thank you for sharing that. What are some of the things that when you said two things, A, that there's something wrong with this, and B, how could, like, it's not the same without these things that we're missing. So can you go into a few more details on each
Yeah.
two categories?
Yeah. So the yoga that, or the yoga studies that I learned growing up were at, the Vivekananda Kendra school in Bangalore in India. And my teacher learned from there, and he had his own yoga school in the US. And him and his wife, you know, ran the school together essentially. And it's, you know, it's fairly small. We had like a really tight knit group. They're great at what they do. And that was my only experience ever learning yoga, aside from with my mom. And my mom learned from we had the same teacher. She's trained in the same tradition as well. And so I think one thing I kind of learned from that is I learned really how to like approach yoga as a therapeutic way of practicing meditation, pranayama especially. But once I went into studios like in New York and I saw how classes are being structured, I was like, oh, they might have just learned things differently, right? Like I didn't really know about like many other traditions at that time. I didn't even know how to use a yoga block or yoga strap because in our tradition, like we didn't have any props. And so even that, right, seeing it, I'm like, what came to my mind first was like, oh, it's probably just like, some different style. I just don't know what it is, which is also true. But there's this other piece where I'm like, well, these studios are really packed and they're like teaching in this specific way with music and like with all this stuff. And I'm like, it's almost like I didn't trust like my ancestry or my heritage enough to like rely on that to be a teacher, which is actually like really sad now thinking about it,
Yeah.
And I had all the tools, our school was like very extensive. You had to do a thesis on a specific like illness or issue, and you had to do a whole like 30-page thesis on like how yoga helps those certain issues. You had to take exams. You had to do like oral exams and practical exams. Like it was actually like very extensive. And this school had nothing to do with Yoga Alliance, which is like a whole separate thing. But then, at the same time, like I was born and raised in New York, even, in an Indian family, but I'm, still, grew up as like an Indian American. And there was just this other part of me that was like, oh, if I want to teach classes, like it needs to look more like that. People are not going to be able to relate if I make it quote unquote too Indian. And at that time, I didn't really see any South Asian teachers in the quote unquote like mainstream like yoga space. I know that they were there and they're still there. I just had no exposure and wasn't connected to any of them. So I think like when I started to teach in studios, like a couple of years after grad school, there was like I had taken another training since then too, and there was like this feeling of who you are inherently does not actually belong here. So you need to change and shift whatever that is so that people will, relate to you more some way. I don't know. I guess like that's what's coming to mind right now. There might be something else there that needs to be uncovered. And, that lasted for quite a long time. And, I never had anyone say my classes were too white, but I definitely had people say my classes were too traditional or that they were too Indian. I've had people say that for sure, or that it was a little too woo-woo for them, or it was a little too out there. But it's like no one ever says, "Oh, your classes are so like sterile. Oh, they're so whitewashed. They're so cultural." No, like nobody says that, right? Because that's what the mainstream culture is doing, and it's so interesting. And that kind of, at least for me, contributed to that feeling of, I can sprinkle this stuff in, but not too much if I actually want to be like whatever it means to be successful. And that's when I started like teaching more in terms of like the westernized like studio space. That's the kind of mentality. I didn't know I had it at the time. Like it was just like a part of my identity and what I did. But like a few years later, I'm like, oh, okay, this is like a real problem because I was starting to like resent how I was teaching, and I wasn't like finding as much joy in it. And I didn't really know why. I figured it was because I was teaching too much or teaching too many classes. But really, a few years later, with the help of like one of my current teachers in the Vinyasa tradition, this is like, oh, you actually like, I was very clear on on the direction I wanted to take with my teaching, but that feeling of shraddha, or like in Sanskrit, like confidence or like trust or faith, it just wasn't there. But like I knew exactly where I needed to go. It was like that trust of, will people respond? And this whole idea of, being a teacher, it's like not about making people like you. And that's like a big part of my personality or my patterning, right? It's like I want to be liked, and I want to be accepted, and I want to belong. I want people to like, a few years ago, I was like, I would have loved if everyone in my class was like, oh my God, that was so great. And now, thankfully, I have like so much more clarity and confidence around that area where it's like, I'm not here to entertain you. And that's like a lot of what like mainstream yoga, or like I would say like westernized yoga has become. It's like, it's a class of entertainment, like who has the best music, who does the most challenging poses, who choreographs it in like the coolest way. And it's just not interested in that, you know? And it's so frustrating because it's like the teachers out there who really understand that and are really getting to like the function and like the essence of what they're doing, like we're all having to like take this like uphill battle to get there.
Yeah.
So
That's how are people were like once you started tuning into your trusting your ancestry and your heritage and putting that out into yoga spaces, how was that been received?
um I think pretty well. I mean, I'll never know if they were, I'm sure there are people out there that like, oh, her classes were so great and now she just chants all the time, you know. I'm sure there are people like who stopped coming to my classes because it was like too much, you know, for them. Or you start talking about like current events and how that ties into our yoga practice. And there are people who don't like that, you know, and they want to come because they think that yoga is an escape, and it's not. And so, and I respect that, and I get that, you know, people are where they are. And I think initially, you know, people definitely leave, right? But one thing, one of my colleagues shared with me a couple of years ago, she's like, you know, when you start like really taking this path, not just in your teaching, but, you know, speaking up for like what you believe in or standing by that, she's like, people will leave, you know, people will unfollow you, people won't like it, they'll feel like more audacity to like challenge you. She goes, but you also don't know, when you open that door, you also don't know who you're opening it up to as well. And that has like, it always makes me cry when I think about it, but that has always stayed with me, because it always helps me it always gives me that confidence whenever I'm like, you know, these like 5 people have like never come back to my class, and they probably never will. But I think, you know, the support of like my colleagues and teachers and friends, and also like with my personal practice, that's been like the cornerstone of really staying connected to like what your role is or what your dharma is. And that's like, I mean, that's the most important thing. But, you know, people did leave. No, you know, I had a couple of places where I worked at where they had some problems with, you know, what I was putting in my teaching. But for the most part, I was pretty, I don't know, I was pretty untouched in a sense. Like no one, I never really had anybody, studio owner or student, you know, say anything really problematic to my face. But I think the positives that came out of it outweighed so much, like it outweighed like any potential negative, because one, I felt like, okay, I have the confidence now to actually pare down the classes that they're, you know, they're fun and they're great, but they're not really bringing me that sense of like fulfillment.
Yeah.
And that's not fair to the students. That's not fair to me. It's not fair to the studio. And so over the last few years, I've like slowly like pared down how much I was teaching, and it opened this whole door of like, oh, actually working one-on-one with patients and clients is really where I can like teach yoga how it was always intended to be taught, like to the individual. And it's so hard to teach a group class like that because everyone's coming in with different experiences, you know, and everyone's coming in with different things that happened to them that day. And I think the problem with like the way yoga is often taught now, this culture appropriate way, is like you get like this you get like a handout almost of like, this is what you're supposed to teach. It's like, no,
Yeah.
like you're actually supposed to like look at the person or look at the people in your class, and everything fits around like their form. You don't like make them push themselves into this box of what yoga is supposed to be. It's the other way around. And that's you know, from at least like the traditions I learned in, like it was always taught like that. So having more space to work one-on-one gave me like some of the confidence to step away from, you know, always jumping into that space of like, how can I change myself to be what people need me to be, versus like, how can I be more of who I am, and whoever is gravitating toward that to like do that work, those people will come. So.
Yeah, I love that. That's so beautiful. And I'm thinking about the Ruby Sales interview that I did on this podcast that
so good. So good.
And now I'm seeing why it resonated. I mean, it's amazing on its own, but I can hear how what she talked about, you know, we kind of give parts of ourselves to fit into this mold of what whiteness says everything's supposed to be. And it feels horrible. And then you're kind of going through life not relying on your ancestry and your heritage and your traditions to keep you grounded and to keep you whole. And yeah, that was a whole other, experience.
Yeah.
That you.
Yeah. So true.
So what does anti-racism mean to you? I like to ask people that question. It's
a big question. I don't know
is
if you can answer it.
I get so many different answers from different people. So there's no
Yeah, I
right
think,
or wrong.
hearing, I think it was Ruby Sales interview, right? Where she said like, I don't like the term anti-racism,
Right.
that like stuck with me so hard. I mean, I still think, the term anti-racism is so important, everything it means, but the idea of like being against something, but not really saying what you're for. Not that everybody does that, of course, but it really stuck with me and made me think about like, what does it actually mean to me? And I think the idea of anti-racism is like, the first thing that comes to mind is like, it's a daily practice. It
Mm.
has to be, has to be a part of like everything that you do, the way you communicate, the way you function in your relationships, your approach to your own yoga practice, how you look, how you, in terms of anti-racism and yoga, like how you look for your teachers, how you look for the classes that you do. One of my friends and teachers, Avita, I wrote down a quote that I just heard her talk on the phone. And I was like, I need to write that down. And it's like, I think of anti-racism and I think of this quote that she said, like, who are you seeking for knowledge? Like,
Mm.
and, what kind of knowledge are you seeking and what kind of knowledge seeker are you? And like those three questions, I'm like that anti-racism and wellness. I mean, probably everyone, I think anti-racism and wellness is what I think of. It's like, what gaze are you using to deem whether something is of value to you or not? And if you're not like always thinking about that, because you have to be, if like you grew up in the West, you basically have to always be thinking about it. Or if you grew up in a post-colonial world, like my parents did in India, all the post-colonial trauma that they don't even, I mean, they know, but maybe they don't like haven't fully like realized it, right? That like my husband and I, like both of our families, like living in a post-colonial world too, it's that white gaze is just like always there all the time. And I think anti-racism is like asking those questions over and over again, everything you do when you're looking for a teacher training to take. Are you looking at it through that white gaze? Do you only see something as valuable if it's led by white teachers? The extreme opposite, right? Are you frantically looking for Indian teachers because you think like that will be authentic yoga too? It's like, well, that's exotifying Indian teachers, right? Because we're not all one and the same either. I'll say for now, like that's part of what it means to me. That's what's coming up.
That's so beautiful. I love, and what type of seeker are you? Because I've been struggling a lot with the white gaze and white centering, because you can't not, it's there. It's so pervasive. And looking back at the way that I have and continue to, but hopefully a little less now, judge the authenticity or not even authenticity, because that's a word that's fraught too, but like the value of something by, does it fit in my little world, what my eyes are used to seeing, what my experience is. And I've totally done that with yoga. And now I find myself, the studio that I had been going to, like I stopped going right before COVID and I cannot imagine going back in there. I can't even walking through there. Even though they now hired a Black teacher and even though they now do fundraisers, I just can't, that doesn't align with me, but it took a long time to get there. And I still struggle with white centering. So these three questions are great. One of the things I loved about that first connected me to you without you even knowing that I existed was I get these daily anti-racism emails. And I'll put the links to those. I'm just making a little note that I'll put the links to those in the show notes. Nicole Cardoza, I post about her a lot on my Instagram. A daily email about different topics relating to anti-racism. And you had written one about spiritual bypassing, which blew my mind into a million pieces because I kind of knew what it was and was working towards understanding it, but you really just made it so clear. And I have passed that along to so many people and used that as a like, start here. Not just start here, because it wasn't like basic, but it was just so well written and so illustrative. And you pointed out an Instagram post, and you and I have talked about this, and I know you kind of maybe we're thinking about whether or not you should have linked directly to it, but I think it was such a good,
Yeah.
because I looked at it, honestly, I followed the link and I looked at it, and it was like every other person in my meditation tradition, every other white person in my tradition posts the same stuff.
Yeah.
And I didn't recognize what was bad about it until I started reading the comments.
Yeah.
All the work I've done, like all this work I've done, and I still like couldn't see it right away. And so I think that was so eye-opening and jaw-dropping for me was, holy crap, there's so much problematic with this post that is just normalized by our culture. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how people in the white gaze who are so used to centering whiteness, because that's what happens, how can we start to, you mentioned these three great questions that, who are you seeking for your knowledge? What type of knowledge are you seeking, and what type of seeker are you? But like, are there specific things, how can someone know before they click a like or follow someone or decide to go to their class? What are things they can look for? And is that an answerable question? And if not, that's okay too.
First off, I'll just like reemphasize those three questions came from Avitha Bunsi. She's also a yoga teacher, and she's awesome. And I can give you her name after the podcast too. I don't know if it's an answerable question, because I mean, it is and it isn't, right? Like, I can give you a bunch of things, like here's a checklist, things to look at, right? And it is a good place to start. But the reason I don't think it's necessarily answerable is because it still takes the onus away from the person having to look at themselves, right? So if I'm going on Instagram and I'm looking at this person's account and I'm like pointing out all this stuff in them, it's like, well, what actually led me to them in the first place? Like, who was I following that told me this is a person I should look at? Like, what, like, I think those questions are the places people need to start. And I think that gets missed so much in the yoga industry here. And with social media, is so helpful in so many ways. In one way, it hasn't really helped that, because it takes all of the power away from like you having to look at yourself, and we can just like spotlight other people all the time, right? Even in that spiritual bypassing email, right, where I linked to this particular teacher's Instagram post as an example of cultural spiritual bypassing in the time of COVID, right? It's a great example. And at the same time, right, everything before those examples is what people really need to be doing, right? It's like, here are some examples that you see out there, but it's not like, we have this checklist and it's like, don't go to a teacher who does this, don't go to a teacher who does that. It's like, well, why are you actually gravitating toward them in the first place? Mm-hmm. It's not about them being like good or bad, right? Like, I don't know. I think like in yoga and Ayurveda, like one thing I always come back to with my clients, like, it's not that pattern. We all have patterns and we need them, right? A pattern is like knowing how to speak English with you on this podcast, or, knowing how to like boil water on my stove or whatever. These, like, it's not about good and bad. It's like, at some point there are some patterns, they just stop being useful for us. And so they might've like, there's some patterns I had when I was younger about like my race and my identity that served a really important function at that time. It like might've helped me to survive while I was in school, when I was always the only Indian person besides my sister, mm-hmm. or survived a lot of other like racist encounters. And there was a way my system responded to that to like help me function. And as an adult, they don't really serve me anymore, but I still I and a lot of us still hold on to them, right? Because they're really familiar and they're so deep seated. And I think that's like part of like what that white gaze is, right? It's so in all of us that we don't even know we're doing it. Yeah. And so it always comes back to like, do you have a practice? Are you doing a practice? Are you working with a teacher who like not only understands you, but understands like the lineage and tradition that they learned in? They have a sense of humility toward the practice. Are they doing that? I think those are things that people can look for, but it really comes back to just like looking at your own life and seeing how that white gaze is present. Like, I, never grew up wearing leggings or yoga pants. I mean, yoga pants weren't a thing when I was younger anyway, but when yoga pants started being like, I don't want to say yoga pants, I'll say spandex pants started becoming like more popular. I've definitely worn them. I definitely have some pairs of like, tight like spandex pants. There was a time where that's all I wore when I practiced yoga, because like I have to have like my leggings. And then at some point, I started to think, I'm like, I never wore this crap when I was younger and practicing. I wore like loose pants or like pajamas or like my Indian clothes. And my teachers never wore any of these things. And it's not to say like, if you like it, fine, right? But it's, again, it goes back to like the patterning. It's like, what is your relationship to all of these things? Like, why are you inherently, when you see a yoga teacher training ad on Instagram and it's a team of white teachers, are you thinking, or like, is there a party that's already thinking like, that must be more valuable than a team of like Black and brown teachers?
Yeah.
No one wants to say that out loud, right? But I do think like those are the questions like we need to be asking ourselves if we're even going to start on that path of like dismantling it. We can't just dismantle something if we don't even know what the root cause is. But I think anyway.
Performative in that way. Yeah, that's such a good point, and thank you for bringing that point up, because we attract what we know and what we want to see and what makes us feel. I'm just thinking of an example right now, the movie Soul, which I just watched and like loved.
Yeah.
And then I read this woman posted on my Facebook group, my Conscious Anti-Racism Facebook group, and I've started to think like the Queen's Gambit. I'm like, there was definitely something problematic, if you haven't seen it or have, about her friend, and I can't remember the name of the character right now. It's a black woman who like plays a role in it, and I'm like, I know there's something problematic, but I can't quite get it. And then I think it was actually maybe it was Me and White Supremacy that I'm reading, or by Layla Saad, or maybe it was an daily anti-racism email talking about like the tropes, you know, the black savior, or the magical black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I'm starting to recognize that like, there's going to be something wrong with this. I might just not know what it is yet. And then being like open to hearing about it. So then I saw a YouTube video about like the 5 major problematic things about that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm telling you, I was like, this is the best movie I've ever seen. It was so good. And I'm like, not even embarrassed, because that's just my indoctrination, you know, and I'm learning like, okay, I can see this YouTube, I can enjoy the movie for what it was, and also recognize that there's a lot in there that's problematic, and to learn about myself. But yeah, like I'm going to think something's amazing if it resonates with me in my worldview. And depending on what that worldview is and what I'm trained to perceive, that's how I'm going to see it.
Yeah.
Did you see the movie?
I did see the movie.
What were you thinking about it?
I really liked, I really liked the whole idea of the movie. My family's really big on karma and afterlife and all of that. They're pretty huge on it. So when we watched it, I was like, it was great in a lot of ways, but some of those problems, I hadn't seen any of like the follow-up videos about the problems with it. But during the movie, my husband and I were watching, and I was like, do you think it's weird that a white woman's voice is in this black man's body for like a majority of the movie? I was like, there seems to be a problem with that. I was like, I don't know if we can keep watching this. And he's like, yeah. He's like, there were so many options for actors and actresses for that role. There were so many opportunities, right? But like, it's just really disappointing, you know? And it's like, I feel like, you know, even with movies like that almost like fakely center Black people is like really problematic.
Yeah.
It feels very performative. It's like, oh yeah, you're so diverse, but like actually you're not really willing to take that extra step, right? Because I don't know what all the reasons might be. But one of the reasons I can think of is like, it's more palatable if it's this way. More people will watch it. It's like this, people can't stand to see a Black person actually the whole movie. And those are some of the issues like those are some of the issues that I've heard about with other films, right? That like seem to center people of color, but like not quite that much, to like where they're not really like the focal point of the movie. And I think that's it's such a huge problem. And it's like, you see that in yoga all the time, right? Like we'll do all the things that make the studio look South Asian. We'll look quote unquote authentic, but we're not actually going to like do the work to address like the issues in yoga. Or we're not actually going to do the work to say like, oh, this is why we have this like particular Hindu deity in our studio. This is what it means to us. This is why it's there. It's like, it's all just there and it's all around, but that effort that actually makes a person of color really feel seen, it's like mainstream culture is just like not willing to do that. And I think that's what's so frustrating.
Yeah.
anyway, that was my issue with it, but I have to say I haven't followed up yet with anybody's commentary, which I'm looking forward to doing.
Yeah, I'll put the link to that. I have so many fun, I love sharing links for things in the show notes. When you and I were talking before about, before we did this interview, you mentioned something about MBSR, and I've been like, mindfulness-based stress reduction, for anyone who is not familiar with that. And it, I feel like there's appropriation in there, and I feel like there's something that needs to be addressed, but I haven't met anyone who's been able to talk about it comfortably with me, like who felt like they knew, and they're like, oh, let me just ask my teacher. Because I'm colleagues and friends with a lot of people who teach it, but that's not something that is explicitly taught, I don't believe, in their training. And I think you said something like, oh, that's a whole other can of worms, or some type of thing. And I was wondering if you could comment about that. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, you know, I have other colleagues I can point you to that teach MBSR and a lot more familiar with like the history of it than I am. You know, I know that the guy who really made it mainstream, like he had to change the name to like make it more palatable. Which is again the beginning of like the whole problem, right? That MBSR, Ayurveda, Tai Chi, yoga therapy, acupuncture, the list kind of goes on and on, right? And there's so many techniques used in like psychotherapy now that come from ancient practices too. I think one of my issues with like using these techniques in like Western medicine or in the healthcare industry is like it's all kind of like the same issue like over and over and over again. But I think the big thing in like the medical in Western medicine, at least in my experience, is like the argument is often like, oh, we're trying to like make it more accessible for patients. We're trying to make it more accessible for people to benefit from it. And isn't the benefit of the practice the most important thing, right? Which of course, if somebody says that, and you're also a healthcare provider, like I am as a yoga therapist at the clinic I work at, when somebody says that to you, right? Like you don't want to be like, nope, the patient getting better is not the most important thing. Like no like doctor or nurse, no one ever says that, right? And I think like that to me is like, it's interesting to me, and I definitely want to explore it more. But this idea that, you know, we're protecting the patient by like diluting it and making it a certain way. I'm always so interested to see like who came up with that reasoning. Someone decided that at some point, right? Or we like, not someone, but like our culture collectively decided that at some point. It didn't just happen like overnight. And I think, you know, I did like a talk on like a really short talk on cultural appropriation with some of my colleagues at this clinic I work at, and it was our like diversity, equity, and inclusivity working group, and they were just super open to hearing about it, which is great. And when we started talking about that, like one of the discussions we had is like, you know, at our hospital, like who decided that we like couldn't use certain words in our yoga therapy and Tai Chi classes, or that it has to be called MBSR and not like what it's traditionally called, or that we don't talk about the history of like where, you know, mindfulness like came from, and like who, like where, when and where was this decided? And I was just telling them like, you know, if like, let's actually think about tracing it back to like where it came from. And more likely than not, it came from like a group of white people who like worked at these hospitals or this healthcare like industry. And they just like decided it for everyone, you know, not outright, not by saying that, but by not saying it, right? Or by silencing, or by saying, okay, but can we call it something different, right? And I think there's so much talk in healthcare about patients benefiting from things and that being the most important thing, but we don't really think about what is it actually doing to the people from that culture that are actually offering those practices. And like, why is that not like just as important?
Yeah.
If they're the ones who are actually passing it down. So I think with MBSR, I think like what is so problematic about it is like, it's so stripped down at this point that I don't even know if you went to like a clinic or you went to a hospital and said, hey, I want to do a talk on the history of this, it would be like crazy, you know, depending on where you go. Sometimes people might be open, but that's never even suggested. Like we all just accept it, like, yep, this is what it's called. And then we're like training a whole new generation of teachers to teach another whitewashed version of it. They're going to train a whole new generation of teachers. And it's like, it's such a problem because we're doing all this work where we think of like protecting the patient or not offending them. We don't even think about like, we don't even give those people a chance to actually learn anything new or to expand their mind. We just assume that they don't want to. And I think that's super, super harmful because it's being done to kids in schools too with yoga as well. But I think that's, to me, like that's the most harmful thing.
Do you think that part of it stems from like separation of church and state, and that people feel like if you talk about yoga, then it's religion, and if you talk about these things, it's like, I'm wondering the intersection of that plus xenophobia and people not being willing to do things that are not the white Christian way, but like, don't be bringing that religion into my child's existence or into my healthcare existence. You know, that other thing, which was designed, I think, to protect religious persecution, but then ends up being harmful. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I
think it can totally be a part of it. I think that a lot of that comes from like misconceptions on what yoga actually is,
Yeah.
and that it is a religion, which it isn't. And that inherently yoga is not like tied to only one religion, though like Hinduism, other religions do practice it. And like yoga philosophy is like inherent in Hinduism, but that doesn't mean yoga is a religion at all. And I think that again comes to like the misinformation, and we accept that, not we, but like say dominant culture accepts like that misinformation, and that's being taken as true, not the actual truth. One thing, I was in a group call yesterday with like 3 really amazing teachers and like thought leaders in like the children's literature space, and one of the co-participants, she does a lot of this work like in schools with educators and parents and on like diverse literature for kids. And we actually had the same question, and I wish I had like a memory where I can remember what she said word for word because it was amazing. But she said, you know, when I get that pushback from like people about, you know, separation of church and state, she's like, there is no real separation of church and state, not even here, because like Christianity and the culture of Christianity is like in all of dominant culture. It's all like centered around that. So she's like, how can you really say that anything's really separate when our lives have been like constructed to be centered around that in so many ways, but we don't even realize it, you know? So I'll just say that her name's Archa, but she mentioned that, and that really stayed with me because it's like, okay, it's not that it's separation of church and state, it's separation of whatever's foreign and what I want to like hold on to, and what's foreign and I don't want to bring in.
Yeah. It's like what's convenient for me to be safe or following it. Yeah, I love that. Okay, well we're running out of time, so I want to honor your time. How can human beings listening to this find you and soak up all of your knowledge and learn from you and work with you?
My website at findyourbreath.net. You connect with me there or sign up for my newsletter, and then also on Instagram, and same handle at Find Your Breath, and you can connect with me there as well. I do teach one-on-one, but I do teach group class series and weekly chanting classes that all kind of center around really connecting to these not always, or I would say underrepresented aspects of yoga. So if you're interested in learning, you can always join in. But yeah, both of those.
Awesome. And I'll put the link to your article in the Anti-Racism Daily as well. Is it linkable? If I got it as an email, is there a link?
Yeah, if you go on Anti-Racism Daily and like on the homepage, there's an archives, and you can just type in spiritual bypassing, and the link there'll be some other related articles to there too, but that link will pop up, and you can just like copy and paste that as an archived article. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much. This was I've done a few interviews on this general topic, and it's so beautiful to hear everyone's different perspectives with seemingly potentially similar backgrounds, but everyone has such beautiful nuances and experiences and knowledge to share. So thank you so much, Melissa, for joining me. And I was just very excited. Social media is the weirdest thing because it's like such an evil thing, but it's so beautiful in so many ways because it allows us to connect. I mean, I never would have found you or learned from you or helped other people learn from you if it weren't for social media. So it's a very double-edged.
So true. So true. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Jill.